This whole nightmare began about 2 months ago at my aunt's party. My sister suddenly approached me with a look of genuine terror in her eyes, telling me she believed someone had been sneaking into her house during the middle of the night. Now, my sister has always been easily frightened by the smallest things: a creaking floorboard, a shadow moving past her window, or even the sound of the wind rattling her doors. So naturally, my first instinct was to be pretty skeptical about her claims. I pressed her for details, asking how she could possibly know someone had been inside her house if she hadn't actually seen anyone. Her response chilled me to the bone. She explained that she had a cable box downstairs that streams directly to her bedroom television upstairs. The first time it happened, she said she'd heard the TV being used late at night when she was certain she had turned everything off before going to bed. Curious and concerned, she had turned on her bedroom television only to discover that someone was actively flicking through the channels. The remote control for the downstairs system was sitting right there on her nightstand, untouched. Yet somehow, someone or something was controlling her television from the living room below. She described watching in horror as the channels changed every few seconds: news, movies, static, shopping networks, as if someone was searching for something specific or simply enjoying the power they held over her sanctuary. This terrifying experience had been happening intermittently for 3 months. Sometimes it would occur multiple nights in a row. Other times, weeks would pass without incident. The unpredictability made it even more frightening. She never knew when she might wake up to the sound of her television being controlled by an invisible presence downstairs. To ease her anxiety and prove to myself that this was all in her head, I volunteered to stay at her place for several nights. I even convinced my younger brother to come along for additional security and to serve as a witness to whatever might or might not happen. We set up sleeping arrangements in her living room, positioning ourselves strategically to observe both the television and the staircase leading to the upper floor. For 4 consecutive nights, we maintained our vigil. We stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, taking shifts to ensure someone was always watching. During those 4 nights, absolutely nothing unusual occurred. The house remained peaceful and quiet. The television stayed off exactly as we left it. There were no mysterious sounds, no unexplained channel changes, and certainly no signs of any intruder. My brother and I became increasingly convinced that our sister was experiencing some form of psychological episode, or perhaps suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. We decided we had stayed long enough to prove our point and informed her that we needed to return to our own lives and responsibilities. When we announced our departure, she became extremely upset and desperate. Tears streamed down her face as she begged us not to leave her alone. She insisted that the presence knew we were there and was simply waiting for us to leave before resuming its torment. I tried to reassure her, suggesting that she call the police immediately the next time anything strange happened, rather than calling us first. She revealed that she had already contacted the police once before about the mysterious intruder. They had responded promptly, searched the entire house thoroughly, checked all windows and doors, and found absolutely no evidence of forced entry or any sign that someone had been inside. This police report only reinforced my belief that my sister was struggling with some form of mental health issue rather than dealing with an actual home invasion. Before leaving, I gave her my phone number and promised that she could call me anytime, day or night, if she needed comfort or support. I believed that with time and perhaps some professional help, she would overcome whatever was causing these frightening experiences. Then I returned to my normal routine and went back to work. 2 days later, at exactly 11:30 p.m., my phone rang. My sister's name appeared on the caller ID, and when I answered, I could immediately hear the terror in her voice. She was whispering and crying simultaneously, telling me that the person was downstairs in her house right at that very moment. Her voice was barely audible, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly might alert the intruder to her location. I asked her how she could be certain someone was there. Through her tears and whispered words, she explained that she could hear heavy footsteps moving around the house below her. These weren't the subtle sounds of settling wood or normal house noises. These were deliberate, purposeful footsteps of someone walking through her home. The desperation and genuine fear in her voice convinced me that this time was different. This wasn't paranoia or hallucination. Something was actually happening. I immediately called my brother and told him to meet me at her house immediately, no questions asked. Throughout the entire 10-minute drive to her house, I remained on the phone with my sister, listening to her describe the sounds she was hearing and trying to keep her calm. When I arrived at her house, my brother was already there, parked outside with his headlights off. We both approached the back of the house carefully, staying on the phone with our sister to coordinate our movements. The first floor of the house was illuminated by the eerie blue glow of the television in the living room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As we crept closer to the patio door, we could see through the window into the living room, and what we saw made our blood run cold. There was a man sitting on the couch, facing directly toward us, as if he knew we were there. He was completely motionless, just sitting there in the darkness, watching the television screen. We were frozen in terror and disbelief. This wasn't our imagination or our sister's paranoia. There was actually someone inside her house. My sister noticed that we had gone quiet on the phone and started asking frantically what was wrong and whether we could see anything. I whispered for her to remain completely silent no matter what happened, then hung up and immediately called the police to report a break-in in progress. The intruder still hadn't moved from his position on the couch. He seemed almost unnaturally still, as if he belonged there or waiting for something specific to happen. Then suddenly the television turned off, plunging the living room into complete darkness. We could no longer see anything inside the house, which made the situation infinitely more terrifying. Moments later, we saw the hallway light switch on, indicating that someone was moving toward the staircase. Our sister was upstairs, alone and vulnerable. Without thinking about our own safety, we made the split-second decision to enter the house through the unlocked patio door. We raced up the stairs as quietly as possible and arrived just in time to catch the intruder standing outside our sister's bedroom door with his ear pressed against it. He had a large kitchen knife in his hand and was clearly preparing to force his way inside. We didn't hesitate. We tackled him immediately and fought him until we could safely extract our sister from the house. During the struggle, we discovered that he had additional weapons concealed in his coat pockets. The police arrived 10 minutes later, but by then, the situation could have ended very differently. If we had arrived even a few minutes later, or if we had decided to wait for the police outside, our sister might not have survived the encounter. The investigation revealed that the intruder was actually someone from our family's past, one of our mother's former boyfriends who had lived with our family during the 1990s. He had always shown an inappropriate interest in my sister, even when she was just a child, but we had never imagined he would escalate to stalking and breaking into her home. This man had been systematically terrorizing our sister for months, entering her house regularly to watch her sleep, go through her belongings, and assert psychological control over her environment. He had spare keys made and knew her daily routine intimately. The television channel changing was just one small part of his campaign of terror. He wanted her to know that someone was in her house, that her safe space had been violated, but he also wanted her to doubt her own sanity. The legal system sentenced him to only 3 years in prison, which felt completely inadequate given the months of psychological torture he had inflicted on her sister. She has since moved back in with our mother and is undergoing intensive therapy to recover from the trauma. Our family is doing everything possible to cut all ties with this dangerous individual and ensure he can never contact any of us again. This terrifying incident occurred when I was 21 years old, during a particularly dangerous period in my neighborhood. There had been a series of violent break-ins throughout our area, and several of my neighbors had been robbed at knife point in their own homes. Even more disturbing, some of these break-ins had included sexual assaults, making everyone in the community extremely paranoid and fearful. The police had not yet caught anyone responsible for these crimes, so every single person in the neighborhood was living in a constant state of high alert and anxiety. I myself was terrified to be alone in my house, especially during the nighttime hours. I had been the victim of a similar violent attack several years earlier, and the trauma from that experience made this new wave of crime particularly triggering for me. Unfortunately, on this particular night, I found myself completely alone in my house. Something woke me up at approximately 1 a.m. Not a loud noise or obvious disturbance, but rather that instinctive feeling that something was wrong in my environment. I lay in my bed, wide awake and listening intently for any sounds that might indicate danger. At first, I couldn't hear anything unusual, so I tried to convince myself that I had simply been having a nightmare or that my anxiety was creating problems where none existed. To calm my nerves and help myself return to sleep, I decided to go downstairs to my kitchen and get a cold drink from the refrigerator. My kitchen windows had no blinds or curtains covering them, which meant that anyone standing in my backyard would have a clear view of everything happening inside. I normally kept a bright light outside my back door during the nighttime hours for security purposes, which provided good visibility of my yard, but also made me highly visible to anyone who might be lurking outside. As I closed the refrigerator door after retrieving my drink, I caught a glimpse of something terrifying in the slightly reflective surface of the door. There was a man standing in my backyard, peering directly into my kitchen through the window. He must have climbed over my back fence to get into the yard, and from his positioning, it was clear that he had been watching me for some time. In the dim light, I could see that he was holding something metallic and shiny in his hand, most likely a knife or other weapon. My heart started racing, and my mind began cycling through all the possible responses to this life-threatening situation. Should I run to my living room and call the police? Should I start screaming to alert my neighbors? Should I try to escape through my front door? Dozens of different escape plans flashed through my mind in a matter of seconds, but I realized that most of them would require me to turn my back on the intruder or leave myself vulnerable during the time it would take to implement them. The man outside clearly had a weapon and the element of surprise, while I was trapped inside with limited options for defense or escape. Then I remembered something that was sitting right there in my refrigerator, half of a large watermelon that I had been eating over the past few days. In a moment of desperate inspiration, I formulated a plan that might convince this would-be attacker that I was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. I opened the refrigerator door again and retrieved the watermelon, placing it on my kitchen counter directly in view of the window where the intruder was watching. Then I opened my kitchen drawer and pulled out the largest, sharpest knife I could find. With the watermelon positioned prominently on the counter, I began my performance. I put on the most deranged, psychotic expression I could manage and started stabbing the watermelon with extreme violence and enthusiasm. The red juice splattered everywhere, across the counter, onto my clothes, and all over my hands and arms. To anyone watching from outside, it would have looked like I was brutally attacking a living victim. As I continued my frenzied stabbing, I began laughing maniacally and making exaggerated facial expressions of pure joy and satisfaction. I wanted to appear as if I was genuinely enjoying the act of violence, as if this was something I did regularly for entertainment. The watermelon juice covering my hands and clothes added to the horrifying visual effect. After several minutes of this theatrical display, I turned directly toward the window where the intruder was positioned and made eye contact with him. I held the knife high above my head, still dripping with red juice, and gave him the most disturbing smile I could produce. I opened my eyes as wide as possible, giving myself a wild, unhinged appearance, and began laughing loudly into the night. Still holding the knife menacingly, I started walking directly toward him, as if I was planning to come outside and include him in my violent activities. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The man stared at me for just a moment, processing what he had witnessed, then turned around and ran away as fast as he could. As he fled through my backyard and presumably back over the fence, he was screaming like a terrified child, loud enough to wake several of my neighbors, who shouted at him to shut up and keep the noise down. I never called the police about this incident, mainly because I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened without admitting that I would have been fully prepared to use that knife on the intruder if my psychological warfare hadn't worked. I also wasn't entirely sure that my improvised defense strategy had been legal, even though it had been effective. That night, I slept with the watermelon knife next to my bed, and I spent the following morning cleaning up the red juice that had splattered throughout my kitchen during my performance. While the incident was terrifying, I felt proud that I had managed to protect myself using only my wits and whatever materials were available. I never saw that particular intruder again, and the series of break-ins in my neighborhood eventually stopped, though I was never sure if my midnight encounter had anything to do with that. What I do know is that sometimes the most effective defense against a predator is to convince them that you're an even more dangerous predator than they are. Story 3. The Jogging Stalker. This experience represents one of the most frightening and psychologically disturbing situations I've ever encountered. I've hesitated to share this story for a long time because it feels almost surreal, like something that happens to other people, but never to someone like me. But this did happen, and it was genuinely one of the scariest experiences of my life. To provide proper context, I need to explain the personal transformation I was undergoing at the time these events occurred. I had always struggled with weight issues, even from childhood. By the time I reached 25 years old, I was 5'7" tall and weighed 250 pounds, definitely not the healthiest person you could imagine. In December of 2019, I had a severe health scare that landed me in the emergency room. That night, lying in the hospital bed, I made a solemn vow to myself that I would become healthier, more confident, and make significant positive changes to transform myself into the person I had always wanted to be. No more self-deprecating thoughts, no more fast food binges, and no more sedentary lifestyle. To everyone's surprise, including my own, I actually managed to stick to this commitment. I completely overhauled my diet, focusing on vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and reasonable portion sizes. I also committed to walking 3 miles every single day around my suburban neighborhood to get much-needed exercise and cardiovascular activity. The area where I live can easily reach temperatures over 100 degrees during daytime hours, making afternoon exercise nearly impossible. After experimenting with both early morning and extremely late evening walks, I determined that the optimal time for my daily exercise was around 9:30 p.m. The temperature was cool and comfortable, there weren't many people around to make me self-conscious about my appearance, and I could use the quiet time for thinking and personal reflection. In hindsight, this decision was probably extremely poor from a safety perspective. Not only did I leave at exactly the same time every single night, but I also followed the identical route every time. I would walk through my suburban neighborhood, cross a busy intersection, and head off into more rural areas until I reached a midway point that I had measured to be exactly 1.5 miles from my starting point. Then I would turn around and walk the same route back home. I maintained this routine for over a year without experiencing anything remotely strange or threatening. During that entire time, I had made remarkable progress with my weight loss, dropping all the way down to 200 pounds. I felt healthier, more confident, and proud of my dedication to self-improvement. Throughout that year-plus period, I encountered maybe 3 or 4 other people total during my evening walks, and those were just neighbors briefly stepping outside to take out trash or retrieve mail. I had never experienced anything that made me feel unsafe or uncomfortable. This all changed right around the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was enjoying my usual evening exercise routine, headphones in and listening to a podcast, when I suddenly felt a strange tingling sensation, as if someone was watching me or following me. It's that instinctive feeling you get when you suspect a bug might be crawling on your skin, but applied to your entire environment. Suddenly, I felt a tap on my left shoulder and let out an embarrassingly loud, startled shriek. When I turned to see who was there, I discovered a man who had somehow managed to approach me completely silently. I had no idea how he had gotten so close without me hearing his footsteps or sensing his presence, especially since I usually kept my music at a relatively low volume. At first glance, the man appeared to be Hispanic, roughly the same age as me, and dressed in athletic wear as if he was out for an evening jog. He had a water bottle clipped to his hip and seemed like any other fitness enthusiast you might encounter in the neighborhood. "Oh, sorry about that," he said with a friendly smile. "I was calling out to let you know I was passing by, but you didn't respond. You're not exactly giving me much room here." He gestured to indicate that in my distracted state, I had wandered into the exact center of the narrow sidewalk, forcing him to choose between jogging through the bushes or out into the street. I took a deep breath and felt my face flush with embarrassment at being so startled by what was obviously just a polite fellow jogger. It was actually a relief to discover such an innocent explanation for my moment of panic. The man seemed genuinely friendly and didn't give off any threatening or unusual vibes whatsoever. I apologized for monopolizing the sidewalk, moved to the right side to give him plenty of room, and he continued jogging on his way. That was the entirety of our first encounter, just a brief, polite interaction that I immediately put out of my mind as I continued with my walk. Over the following days and weeks, I began seeing him more frequently during my evening routes. Initially, it was perhaps once every week or two, and we would always exchange friendly greetings and brief conversations. I actually found it quite pleasant to have a kind of informal jogging companion, especially since I was trying to be more social and outgoing as part of my overall self-improvement efforts. After several weeks of these casual encounters, we exchanged names during one of our conversations. He told me his name was Jacob and explained that he was relatively new to the area and still experimenting with different routes for his evening exercise routine. This explained why I had been seeing him more frequently. He was exploring various paths through the neighborhood and occasionally choosing the same route I used. With the ice now broken between us, our conversations became longer and more detailed whenever we encountered each other. We would discuss our respective fitness goals, share observations about the neighborhood, and engage in general small talk about our daily lives and experiences. Eventually, after about 6 months of these regular encounters, Jacob began timing his evening jogs to coincide exactly with my walking routine. He would join me for the first portion of my walk, jogging slowly alongside me while we chatted, before our paths diverged and he continued on his own route. I genuinely began to consider him a friend, and I felt proud of myself for successfully developing a social connection with someone outside my usual circle. Our conversations provided additional motivation for me to maintain my exercise routine, and I looked forward to our regular meetings. However, after about 8 months of this routine, I became seriously ill and had to suspend my evening walks for approximately 2 months while I recovered. When I finally felt well enough to resume my exercise routine, I discovered that my motivation had significantly decreased due to the prolonged break in my established habits. When I returned to my walking routine, Jacob was nowhere to be found. I assumed he had simply discovered a different route or changed his exercise schedule while I was absent, and I felt somewhat disappointed to have lost my walking companion. Since we had never exchanged phone numbers or other contact information, I had no way to reach out to him. I resigned myself to continuing my walks alone and tried to recapture the motivation and enthusiasm I had felt before my illness. However, I began experiencing something very unsettling during a particular section of my route. About 3/4 of the way through my walk, there's a section where the path passes through an area with no street lighting, flanked by a large open field on one side and dense shrubs and trees on the other. This area then opens up into standard suburban neighborhoods with proper street lighting and normal residential development. I had never felt uncomfortable or unsafe in this area before, but approximately 1 week after resuming my walking routine, I started experiencing an intense feeling of being watched whenever I passed through this section. The sensation was so strong and consistent that it couldn't be dismissed as simple paranoia or imagination. One evening, I decided to investigate this feeling more thoroughly. When I reached the area with the large shrubs and trees, the sensation of being observed was stronger than ever. I stopped walking and began looking around carefully, trying to identify the source of my unease. I stepped closer to the shrubs to get a better view of the area behind them and accidentally stumbled on the curb. As I tried to catch myself, I planted my foot firmly in the soil near the base of the bushes and immediately felt my foot impact something solid that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. In that same instant, 3 terrifying things happened simultaneously. I heard a male voice cry out in pain and surprise. I realized I had stepped on someone who was crouched in the bushes, and I looked up to see Jacob standing there in the shadows among the shrubs, staring at me with an expression of shock and panic. For several seconds, both of us were completely frozen, unsure how to react to this unexpected confrontation. I could hear myself making strange guttural sounds as I tried to process what was happening and find words to speak. Jacob appeared equally stunned and uncertain about what to do next. In that moment of crisis, I discovered that I was definitely a flight person rather than a fight person. Without conscious thought, I jumped to my feet and began running faster than I had ever run in my life. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, even though there was no one around to hear me, and I lost my headphones somewhere during my initial panic. The experience felt almost like an out-of-body episode. I could hear myself screaming and see myself running, but it didn't feel like I was in control of my actions.